Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game, and you're listening to PTCG Radio. Now, this week we're going to be looking primarily at US Nationals, but there's actually two facets of US Nationals we need to look at. Firstly, we need to, of course, look at US Nationals, that's fairly important, but also we need to be having a look at the Professor Cup. Now, there hasn't been a huge amount of talk about this yet, it is going on, so I'm going to go through the format today and tell you what to play. Some we've neglected till now, but let's go and have a look at the Professor Cup today. It's fairly straightforward, to be honest. There's really three types of decks that I think need to be considered. A couple of things before we get going. In lieu of news, there isn't really any news to speak of per se at the moment. And first things first, my YouTube channel, PTCG Radio, can be found nice and easily at youtube.com/PTCG Radio. We've got a custom URL and everything now. And if you go there, there's a couple of updates. I have recorded a video of me opening some hilariously fake Spanish cards. And what was even more fantastic about that is the fact that, quite frankly, as well as it being, fun in that way, we've also got a bunch of Spanish chaps and ladies have actually commented on the video, giving us a little more feedback, a little more kind of exposition on those cards. That's really interesting, so I encourage you to go and check that out. I've also started uploading the League Challenge from Nottingham, which went on last weekend, and round one is already up, showing Night March from a Worlds player who has made top 22 in Europe this year, got on a paid invite all the way to day 2, playing against a Rayquaza player who has his Worlds invite for this year. So, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, good players, good decks, and rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all going to be going up on there over the next few days, week and a bit. So I encourage you to check out all of them. And as I keep saying, please check out my new video game channel, Wassy Plays, which can be found just by searching Wassy Plays on YouTube, or indeed by looking at the featured tab on the right hand side of YouTube when you go to PTCG Radio, and you will find it there quite nicely. Now, in terms of also news, I got a fantastic email from Lauren Miller this past week, who made an excellent point. I keep talking about Fliptini rotating. Now, Fliptini is the Victini which was reprinted and kept in the format by Legendary Treasures, which was basically, it allows you to reflip coins. It's got an ability, and if you flip coins for an attack, you get to reflip them as you like. Now, Lauren Miller's email to say you keep talking about Fliptini, but actually rotating, but you don't mention how Trick Coin can be used as a decent substitute for it. And absolutely correct. Now, Lauren, Loren, I believe it's a guy. I don't actually know. Lauren can be a boy's or a girl's name, so I'm going to say guy, but if Lauren Miller is a girl, I do apologise. In the UK, Lauren's only really used as a girl's name, but it's generally spelled Lauren. I believe Lauren's spelled that way as a chap's name, but do correct me if I'm wrong. Now, Trick Coin is a Pokemon tool which you attach to your Pokemon, and it reads once during your turn, after you flip any coins for an attack that a Pokemon this card is attached to, you may ignore all effects of those coin flips and begin flipping those coins again. And there is an addendum there, you may only use effects that let you flip coins again, including effects from other cards, once during your turn. So all of these Pokemon that are flipping coins, you can use Trick Coin, but it doesn't stack, whereas Fliptini, I believe, could stack. So you could have two Fliptinis on the bench and try it twice. I might double check that one. But yeah, so Trick Coin is, thank you to Lauren for that email. I believe Fliptini, it's there. No, I was wrong. Victory Star was Victini's ability, and it could only be used once per turn. So ignore what I just said. So, getting into, let's start with Canadian Nationals. Now, I don't want to go into a huge amount of details about every single deck and all of that. It was largely what we thought. What I do want to do is mention a couple of decks. First of all, there was a top 8 appearance by Evil Tao, Absol, Bats. And this basically fits the same kind of format in terms of deck here as all Bats decks. Bats decks, by which I mean you've got your Golbat and your Crobat. Some of these are going to be featuring in the Nottingham League Challenge videos, which I've been doing. and going to be on my channel over the next few days. And essentially, you evolve Zubat into Golbat, and you get to place 2 damage counters on any one of your opponent's Pokemon. And then you evolve Golbat into Crobat, and you get to place 3 damage counters on any of your opponent's Pokemon as you like. Although it's got to be all 3 to one Pokemon, you can't do to different Pokemon. So, the interesting thing about this is that it's become kind of a deck in that generally people will just go, you know what, something and bats. But the something they always have in common, they are generally efficient attackers. So you see Seismitoad bat. Seismitoad does 30 damage for 1 double colourless energy and locks them out of trainers while you sit there using bats. Landorus does 30 to the active, 30 to the bench while you sit there doing damage with bats. Now, Yveltal is the same kind of thing. You can use non-EX Yveltal that does 30 damage for 1 energy and attaches an energy to the bench while you sit there doing damage with bats. And of course you can beat up Yveltal EX, whose Evil Ball attack for, well, I mean, you do it for dark and a colourless, but it does 20 damage plus 20 more for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. So 2 on your opponent's Pokemon, 3 on yours, and you do 120 damage. 100 damage for the 5 energy, plus 20 is 120. And then you can add to that with Muscle Band, etc. So you can essentially sit there behind an Yveltal and, you know, do 30 damage per turn, 50 with a Muscle Band, attach energy to build up a big Yveltal EX while doing little damage with bats as well. It's not amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but Landorus Bats isn't necessarily amazing. What it is, and by amazing I don't mean it's not a good deck, I mean it's not some kind of absolutely groundbreaking formula. It's not some powerhouse one-hit KOing everything. What it's doing is it's sitting there and it's starting right away on turn 1 and it's efficiently dealing damage throughout the game. Now the Absol is, well, I mean there's 2 Absol. One you can use is the Plasma Freeze Absol, which does Mind Jack for a dark and a colourless, 20 damage, plus 20 more for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And decks at the moment tend to have a lot of bench Pokemon, so that's a really efficient attacker. Bearing in mind, of course, that non-EX Yveltal can attach the second energy. So although you are attacking for 2 energy attachments, you can do one of them with the Yveltal. I've said again and again on this podcast how I'm a fan of attacks that can be done for a single energy. And although this takes 2 energy attachments, Yveltal helps out. Now there is also the Roaring Skies Absol that's got the ability which allows you to move 3 damage counters from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another of his Pokemon. And again, this combos quite nicely with Yveltal and bats. Now, I don't know which Absol the person was using. I don't really mind which Absol they were using because I would be a fan of using both. I like the Mind Jack Absol as an efficient non-EX attacker. It can do 120 damage if your opponent's got a full bench for just 2 energy. And that is an efficient attacker no matter how you look at it. Now it's also weak to Psychic, not Lightning, so if you come across a Lightning Pokemon, you can get a bit more mileage out of Absol than you can with Yveltal. It is weak to Fighting though, which is a bad weakness at the moment. The other Absol from Roaring Skies essentially allows you to move around damage counters, like a poor man's Dusknoir. So essentially you do 30 damage or 50 with Yveltal, you spread some damage around with bats, and you're not killing anything too quickly. Your opponent is going to have the opportunity to move their Pokemon from the active to the bench, making it more difficult for you to KO them. So you can use Absol to move some damage around while you're putting damage down with your Golbats and your Crobats, and it's just a nice efficient way of taking out your opponent's Pokemon without having to waste a Lysandra bringing them active. I don't know if this is an amazing deck. Certainly it seems to have trouble with stuff like Raichu, but it's a deck that did well at Canadian Nationals. Now, Canadian Nationals have in the past had a bit of a history of having unusual decks do well. Sometimes they match quite nicely with US Nationals. Other times they don't. Cough, Golem, cough. And so, I'm not saying that this deck did well at, Canadian Nationals, it's going to own US Nationals. What I am saying is it's a deck to keep in mind. One deck I really do want to talk about, and this won Canadian Nationals, and it's a deck that you really, really should be thinking about for US Nationals, is Metal. Now, we have to have a disclaimer here. The winner of Canadian Nationals this year was Chase Maloney. And Chase Maloney has now become one of those players, kind of like Jason Glasinski. I am easily ready here to call Chase Maloney one of the best, definitely in the top 5 or 6 players in the world, if not higher. Chase Maloney has become one of those players where, first of all, it's kind of unfair if he's in the same tournament as you. But also, he's gotten to the point now where if he does well with a deck, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be that it's an amazing deck. It could just mean that he's just that good a player. Now, he came onto the scene as a world champion winner, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about this. See if I can look it up as we're talking here. But if I remember correctly, Chase Maloney won Worlds the year I went, back in 2012, as a senior. And, of course, as a senior, everybody goes, well, can't really rely on that. He's a senior. Masters is much more difficult. You can't really rely on that. And there's an argument to be made there. And then he comes back in 2013, and he comes 29th and doesn't make top cut at Worlds. And now you're thinking, well, okay, fair enough. Maybe it was a one-hit wonder. And then last year, 2014, he comes around, and Chase Maloney ends up getting, he was a 6th seed. He goes out in top 8 of Worlds. So in 2 years, he's won Worlds in Senior and made top 8 in Masters, as well as coming 29th in Masters a year before, which is no mean feat in and of itself. As well as winning, nationals, as well as winning regionals after regionals here, and then winning Canadian Nationals. And it might just seem like I'm kind of sitting here doing a bit of a loving party for Chase Maloney. That's not my intention, ladies and gentlemen. But I think it must be pointed out that there are some players who are just that damn good at making decks and at playing, and that we must bear in mind that these players do have a tendency to do well no matter what they're playing. But I love his deck, so let's have a quick look. It was a metal deck. Now, I'm not entirely sure what was in it, but I can tell you that it had Bronzong in. And Bronzong is like electric from Noble Victories for people that were playing back then. It is a metal Pokemon that allows you to attach a basic metal from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. It's got an ability. Now, it's not a basic Pokemon, so the ability is not shut off by your opponent playing a Silent Lab, because remember, Silent Lab only turns off abilities of basic Pokemon. It is turned off by Wobbuffet, and it is turned off by Garbodor, but Garbodor is not seeing a huge amount of play. So, it's seeing some play, and it could well see more play because of Metal. But Metal's been one of those decks which, for a long time, everyone just kind of expected to be good. And then it wasn't great, and everyone just said, well, these Metal decks were really good back around Noble Victories when Electric was out, but the format's moved on since then. It's not the same game. Well, Bronzong's making a comeback. And I think one of the main reasons for it is Aegislash. Aegislash is a wonderful Pokemon that people have really started to really get in touch with, especially since the banning of Lissandra's trump card, because it's a brilliant deck that shuts stuff down. Now, it's not a great Pokemon in terms of attacking. It does 40 damage, plus 20 more for each metal energy, for a minimum of 3 energy. So even if you get 3 metal energy, you're only hitting there for 100. It 2 hits pretty much everything in the format, so it's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. But it's not a great attacker. The thing that makes Aegislash great is its ability Mighty Shield. Prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from each of your opponent's Pokemon that has special energy attached to it. I.e., it is immune to attacks from Pokemon that have special energy. Now, just to be clear, it's only damage, which means, let's say, for instance, if anyone but me is trying to play Chandelure EX, and I've tried and I've failed, the second attack wouldn't do 70 damage, but it would still burn and confuse. So special conditions still will affect Aegislash, and let's not forget we've got lasers here. One thing that should be pointed out is that there is a stadium, Steel Shelter I believe it's called, which works for metal Pokemon, and it makes them immune to status conditions. So if you've got an Edge-Slash in the active and you've got Steel Shelter out as your stadium, no damage from any Pokemon that have special energy attached to it, and no special conditions. And that's pretty damn good. Now, we're going to talk more about him in a minute. I want to also mention a card which saw a bit of play in Chase's deck, which a lot of people weren't loving, was the Phantom Forces Heatran. And when I talked about Phantom Forces Heatran on the podcast, I believe what I basically said was decent but underwhelming. For a metal and a double colourless, it does 40 damage, 80 if there's a stadium in play. And in the current format, there's always a stadium in play. So for 3 energy, including a double colourless, it does 80. Or for 4 energy, including a double colourless, 2 metal, double colourless, it does 130 in discarded energy. It is a very efficient non-EX attacker. Now, in any other deck, this would be an attacker that was overpriced. But the fact that you can use Bronzong to accelerate means that this is actually a viable Pokemon. Now, don't get me wrong, you've got Dialga EX that can hit for 170 with a Muscle Band, and Heatran can only hit for 150, but the bonus with Heatran is the fact that he's a non-EX. So, I like Heatran. I still think there's times you're going to need a big attacker, and my preferred big attacker would be Dialga, but to be honest, Dialga now I reckon is down to a 1 or a 2. Because we don't need him anymore. We don't need him to be coming out and doing a whole bunch of damage because he's doing 170, but that's not really what the deck is revolving around. What the deck is revolving around, and this is a Phantom Forces Dialga, of course, not the Plasma Blast Dialga. What the deck is revolving around is efficient attackers, reserving your energy, and blocking with Edge-Slash. And let's also mention that you've also got Mewtwo here, and you've also got Seismitoad. Now, as it's the week before Nationals, I'm not so worried about the specific build of decks that won previous tournaments. The whole point of today's section on US Nationals is to give you ideas of decks to play. Now, I know we're very close to Nationals, but even if it's not decks to play, maybe you've got your deck sorted out. Hopefully what I can do here is give you a checklist of, essentially a checklist of decks that you need to be able to beat. Now, Dialga is a good thing in these metal decks because it can do 150 damage, 170 with a Muscle Band. But you've also got the Heatran I mentioned. You've got the Edge-Slash that blocks attacks from Pokemon with special energy, and you've then got Seismitoad. Now, you've got Bronzong, who can accelerate energy, and you're playing DC anyway. And then you've got Mewtwo, and what you can do here is just pile a bunch of energy on Mewtwo using Bronzong, and just kind of sit there behind Seismitoad, or sit there behind Edge-Slash, and then slam them with Mewtwo, pretend like it's still 2 years ago, when that was a viable strategy. So, there's awful lot of things that can be done with this metal deck. Clearly Edge-Slash and Bronzong, but then you really want to be considering Heatran, Dialga EX, Seismitoad, and Mewtwo. I'm not entirely sure I'd play Dialga. I think I might put one in there, but I would be focused on a couple of Seismitoad, couple of Mewtwo, couple of Edge-Slash, couple of Heatran, really giving myself the option here. Because this is a kind of deck where not the same thing is going to work against every deck. So, for instance, if you bring out a metal deck against a Donphan and you just try going aggressively with Edge-Slash, you are going to be... It's not going to work terribly well. You're just not going to have a good time with that. Donphan is going to be hitting you for 80 for 1 fighting energy, and Edge-Slash will struggle against Donphan, especially when they're putting up Pokemon that Edge-Slash can't kill, or indeed, I'm thinking like Safeguard Pokemon here, or just Robo-Substitutes. But if you're playing against Donphan, you go for Heatran. Heatran can do 130 damage for 4 energy, that one hit KOs a Donphan, and with Donphan, if they're not using strong energy, and if they use strong energy, up comes Edge-Slash. And if they're not using Fighting Stadium, because Heatran's not an EX, then for 1 energy, Donphan maxes out at 60, 40 plus 20 for a Muscle Band. So now, Donphan is free hit KOing a Heatran. So although a Donphan list would run through Edge-Slash and Dialga quite quickly, it could potentially really struggle with a Heatran. You're one-hitting them, they're free-hitting you, and you'll still have to probably draw into your Lissandras or VS Seekers in order to pull up their Donphans and get through the robo-substitutes, but you're going to have turn after turn to actually do it. So, like I say, I think the whole point with this, and I think that's why, a player like Chase Maloney has done so well with this. Really good players, from my experience, tend to lean towards decks that have options, because then that allows them to, firstly, to try and outplay their opponent, but also really good players hate taking auto losses. They would rather, and again, I'm talking generally here, but they would generally rather go ahead and use a deck which has no really good or really bad matchups than a deck which has a bunch of really good matchups and then a bunch of matchups where you're going to be very, very worried about them. So that's pretty much the metal deck. I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I think I've said my piece when it comes to that metal deck, shall we say. So, when it comes to decks for US Nationals, I've basically split them into two lists. I've identified 10 decks. Now, just so we're clear, I am not saying there's not going to be some magic mystery deck that comes out at US Nationals. It's happened before. And I'm not saying that I'm going through every deck. I am going by what I've seen people talking about online, the results of Nationals that have happened so far in this format, and my experience of having been to a couple tournaments in this format. And I'm basically giving you 4 decks which I think are really good, and I'm going to give you 6 decks which are not terribly good. And maybe I'll think of 1 or 2 others as we go through to kind of add into the list there. So first of all, let's start off with, as far as I'm concerned, your top 4 choices for US Nationals this year, in no particular order. So let's start off with a deck that everybody went ahead and basically said, you know what, now Lissandra's trump card is banned, I'm going to go and play, and that deck is Night March. Night March is an exceedingly simple deck at its core. You've got Joltik and Pumpkaboo, who have the Night March attack, which does 20 damage times the amount of Pokemon with Night March in your discard pile. Joltik for a DCE, Pumpkaboo for a DCE, as long as you've got Dimension Valley in play. You can then use Mew to copy the attack, and Mew can actually do Night March for 1 energy and a Dimension Valley, as long as you've got a Joltik on the bench, because Mew can copy Joltik's attack, and then reduce the attack cost by 1 for Dimension Valley. And that's it at its simplest form. You play Lampent as well, because it's got Night March. You chuck as many as you can and discard as fast as you can, and you try and win the prize trade. It's as simple as that. Some people play Mew, and at this rate, and I'm going mostly by Ryan Morehouse's list here. He's the chap I've just put up on my YouTube channel yesterday, the new video. I believe he's actually scraped in at 22nd in Europe, got himself the paid invite and the automatic trip to day 2. He basically plays 1 Archie's Ace in the Hole and 1 Empoleon. So you discard the Empoleon with your Battle Compressors early game, and then you get to just play Archie's Ace in the Hole, put Empoleon on your bench as if it were a basic Pokemon and draw 5 cards. Empoleon gives you, it's got the ability Diving Draw, so you discard a card from your hand and draw 2. And that also really helps you to discard Night Marches as well, which is something you need to do. You need to get those bad boys in a discard pile. And of course, it's got a nice attack for 1 Water Energy, which does 10 times all the Pokemon in play. And you've got to play some basic energy, and it doesn't matter which ones. You can easily afford to play the Water Energy. I like Night March, but I have some reservations. Firstly, it's prone to draws. Even though it can take fast KOs, it takes a long time. Your first couple of turns with Night March take a while. You have to basically run through your entire deck to get everything in the discard pile and get ready to go. And that can take a long time. The other thing, of course, is that because you're playing with a lot of weak Pokemon, you do lose games sometimes just because your opponent's set up faster than you. So draws are a problem, and in a big tournament like US Nationals, you like to have about 1,000 people there. Too many draws and you're out. Simple as that. The other problem with Night March are a couple of them. Firstly, it is generally overly reliant on double colourless energy, so you can occasionally find yourself short and missing an attack. I know Mew can do it for 1 energy, as long as there's a Dimension Valley out and a Joltik on the bench, but that's a lot to ask for, and then you've got your 120 HP EX giving up 2 prizes in the active. It ain't ideal. The other problem, though, is it's really good against EX decks, and it struggles against non-EX decks. The whole point of Night March is that it's basically got a really good prize trade. you're using non-EX Pokemon to KO EX Pokemon, and it works out nicely. So a deck like something like Groudon or maybe Rayquaza, it's quite good against, etc., etc. You're sitting there laughing. I mean, traditionally it was really good against Rizzy and Genesect, although I can't imagine anyone playing that at Nationals, at least not anyone that does well. But you put it against something like Donphan, and it's got a terrible Donphan matchup. Now, a really good player of a really good list can make it an almost 50-50 game, but that's the best you can hope for. Donphan's one-hitting you, while you're one-hitting Donphan, except you've got a Lysandre every turn to KO a Donphan. Now, don't get me wrong, you hit Lysandres faster than they get Donphans out and you're winning. But it's difficult. Moving on, we have Rayquaza, another deck which wasn't particularly great before we banned Lysandre's trump card, is now a lot better. It couldn't keep up with the ridiculous amount of hammers that could be played when we had Lysandre's trump card. With the hammers gone, Rayquaza is back. Now, it's another deck that can take a little while to set up, not in terms of the amount of turns, but just in terms of the actual physical time it takes you to run through enough cards to set up. But it's a very straightforward deck. And it's got an awful lot of advantages. You can evolve Rayquaza the turn you put him down using Mega Rayquaza's Delta Evolution. You can evolve him without losing your turn using Spirit Link. And you can get the free energy in one turn using double colourless energy and using the trainer card Mega Turbo to attach a basic energy from your discard pile to your Mega EX. You can use Skyfield to Stadium to have up to 8 bench Pokemon, and then your attack does 30 times the amount of bench Pokemon. Now, Rayquaza's generally very good against pretty much everything. Big EX decks, it's generally getting one-hit KOs faster. I mean, Donphan, although it's Donphan, I'm going to keep talking about Donphan, it's not one of the best decks, but oh my goodness, I love it. Donphan's pretty good against big EX decks, but Rayquaza, oh my goodness, it doesn't take a long time to kill a 220 HP Pokemon that's resistant to you. It sucks. So yeah, it ain't good. Rayquaza has problems. It can misfire. It's a very straightforward deck, and the problem with straightforward decks is if you fail to get set up, your opponent's going. It's also got an easily counter weakness with lightning in that, you've got Raichu, a stage 1 Pokemon that attacks for double colourless, which can end up counting you quite nicely. Now, you have got your Altaria, which again has Delta Evolution, so you can evolve it straight away, and Altaria allows you to basically, it gets rid of the weakness of your colourless Pokemon. But in order to get your Altaria out, you've got to find both pieces. You're generally playing a 1-1 line. One part might be prized. You might be going for other Pokemon, etc. Just because you've got this Pokemon that gets rid of weakness does not guarantee that weakness will never be a problem. So, just to reiterate, bad weakness, can struggle to set up, but a powerhouse once it gets going. And against an awful lot of decks, when you get set up with Rayquaza, you win. Moving on to the third deck, which I'm putting in, I suppose, let's call it the top tier, and that's Fighting Bats. Now, I talked about Fighting Bats quite a lot on the last couple of podcasts, so I'm not going to go into huge detail, and if you want me to go into detail, it is featuring on, I believe, rounds 3 and 4 of the tournament, which I'm uploading to YouTube at the moment. And essentially, you revolve around your Golbat and Crobat, which I've already spoken about. And then you've got Landorus, who for 1 fighting energy does 30 to the active, 30 to the bench. And you've got Hawlucha, who for 1 fighting energy does 62 EXs. And then you've got your strong energy Muscle Band Fighting Stadium to increase that. You've even got things like Focus Sash, so that Hawlucha doesn't get 1-hit KO'd. Remember, Focus Sash is a Pokemon tool where if you would be 1-hit KO'd, you discard Focus Sash and go down to 10 HP instead. And I'm almost ready to call Fighting Bats my number 1 deck. I think even against something like Night March, it's really quite good in terms of, being able to get a lot of mileage and get a lot of KOs very quickly. The biggest problem for Fighting Bats is Rayquaza. You can take out a lot of their Pokemon, you can take out their Shaymins with your Hawluchas, because Hawlucha, with just a strong energy Muscle Band Fighting Stadium, will 1-hit KO a Shaymin for 2 prizes. But if they set up a Rayquaza, you're back to Donphan syndrome. You're a 220 HP EX, Mega EX, with a resistance to you. Now, Hawlucha goes through resistance, and you can 2-hit KO with Hawlucha. But one turn, you're going to need Fighting Stadium and Strong Energy and Muscle Band, and then the next turn, you're going to need 2 of them. So it's going to be very, very difficult. When you get set up, it really hurts. And it struggles with Rayquaza when they get set up. They won't always get set up, but when they do get set up quickly, you are probably going to lose. Other than that, I really like this Fighting Bats deck. I'm a big fan of it. One little tip I'm going to give you, if you're playing Fighting Bats at Nationals, find room for 1 or 2 Silent Labs if you can. Now, I know Fighting Stadium's usually the better stadium, but Silent Lab will turn off your Mr. Mime. And against a Night March deck, if you can just have 1 or 2 turns where Mr. Mime is off, you can take extra prizes. Joltik dies on the bench to 1 hit from a Hammerhead. Pumpkaboo's going to get hit for 30 on the bench, and you combine that with a hit from a Crobat, and Pumpkaboo's going to die on the bench. Now, don't get me wrong, you can also just KO the Joltiks and the Pumpkaboos using Crobat and Golbat. But if you can get 1 or 2 turns of hitting with Hammerhead where their bench is unprotected, it's going to be much easier to win that game. If you expect a lot of Night March, and you should, I'd probably only put 1 or 2 in there, because Fighting Stadium is going to be better in a lot of matchups. And I know that it might seem a bit superfluous, and some of you are probably sitting there listening right now going, this guy's a moron, why the hell would I put that in my deck? But remember, you're also less reliant on Shaman than a lot of decks. So what you can even do with your Silent Lab is just stick it down against a Rayquaza deck to stop them setting up with Shaman. It's a versatile little deck. A little stadium. I would play it. And yes, I know your Rayquaza deck's going to be playing Skyfield, and they're going to counter it. And I know that your Night March decks are going to be playing Dimension Valley, and they're going to counter it. Well, that's alright. You gain a massive advantage for a minimum of 1 turn until they counter it. I'm alright with that. And then the final deck is the Metal deck. And the reason I've left this till last is I want to point out that Night March is incredibly reliant on special energy. Hello, Edgeslash. Even Mew, which, like I say, can attack for 1 non-special energy, just for 1, psychic or water or whatever you're playing, well, that's alright. Edgeslash has a resistance to psychic, so you're going to have to do 200 damage. That's 10 Night Marches in the discard pile out of a possible 12, or 9 plus a muscle band, to get the KO. And then they've got a 120 HP EX in the active that you can then 1-hit KO with your non-EX Heatran. I really like it against Night March. Against Fighting Bats, okay. You're going to be resistant to your Crobat if they try attacking with Crobat. And they are not going to be able to hit you with strong energy, which means any damage that they do from Hawlucha and from Landorus is going to be stunted. Of course, if they put strong energy down, they can't attack you, and if they don't, they're not doing as much damage. And then, of course, we've got Rayquaza. Most Rayquaza decks that I've seen, your average list plays 4 DCE and 4 or 5 basic energy. Now, if you get an Edgeslash out, their DCEs are off the table. They cannot KO you if they put a DCE on Rayquaza. So that means they need to attach 3 basic energy. That's 3 of the 4 or 5 that they're playing, and they can only attach 1 per turn. So if they want to get going in 1 turn, they've got to hit 2 Mega Turbos. If they've got 1 or 2 energy prize, they might even literally not be able to attack. So already we can see that these Metal Edgeslash decks might have an advantage over all 3 of the ones there. If I had to pick one of them to go to Nats with at the moment, I would really struggle. I would be going Metal, or I'd be going Fighting Bats. I don't like how Night March can tend towards draws sometimes, and how it's got really weak weak Pokemon. There's not going to be a huge amount of people playing Latios EX at Nationals, but Latios EX is going to donk your Pumpkaboo or your Joltik, and that's going to be annoying. And if they go first, remember, they can attack on the first turn of the game. That, ladies and gentlemen, shall we say, it's far from ideal. It ain't great. Now, yeah, Fighting Bats or Metal, to be honest. I'm a fan. The other thing is Rayquaza, like I say, I'm just not a huge fan of the fact it's a very linear deck. It either gets set up or it doesn't. Now I'm going to quickly run through the other half dozen decks which I think you should be considering. All of these I've spoken about on the podcast recently, so I don't need to go into a huge amount of detail. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the 6 types of decks, and I'm going to let you know essentially why they fit into my tier 2. I am not saying these decks can't win nationals or you shouldn't play them. What I am saying is I don't think they're as strong as a choice given the expected metagame as the 4 decks I've given you. Firstly, Donphan. I love me some Donphan. The fact of the matter is, it's got a terrible matchup against Rayquaza, but it can work against Metal if they don't hit their Lysandras. I love it against Night March, and it's pretty good against Fighting Bats. I would consider putting in just one Mr. Mime for these fighting decks, because Landorus can really be a killer. I lost a best of 3 last weekend to a deck with Landorus in. A game I should have won. Now, one game I got benched on turn 2 because I couldn't draw a second basic, and the other game I had to Juniper, and I'm not exaggerating here, all of my VS Seekers and supporters by turn 3, or not have any energy to attack. But even bearing that in mind, I still would have won the game had it not been for the brutal bench damage from Landorus building up turn after turn. I'd put a Mr. Mime in there. The problem is, it really struggles against Rayquaza, and even decks like Metal and Edgeslash, as soon as they hit, if they can hit their VS Seeker / Lysandra faster than you can hit your Donphans, you're gonna lose the game. Groudon is a deck which I'm becoming less and less keen on as the format goes on. Groudon hits for 200 damage if there's a stadium in play and discards the stadium, and that's all well and good, but Groudon has problems. Namely, it's slow. 4 energy attachments. And yes, I know you've got Mega Turbo, and I know you can use a non-EX Landorus, although don't because it's terrible. But the fact of the matter is, Night March is going to get a good 2-hit KO before you've probably got set up. And Fighting Bats can do a whole bunch of damage, especially, if they can get energy on the Landorus while you're setting up the Groudon. If they can get Hawluchas going against your Groudon with Focus Sash, then you're 2-hit KOing them. By the way, if you're playing Rayquaza or you're playing Groudon, play a minimum of 1 Startling Megaphone, because things like Hawlucha will kill you. There's nothing more frustrating than being 2-hit KO by a Hawlucha while you're doing 300 or 240 damage and not killing them. So, Groudon, I don't like its Rayquaza. And the other thing is Rayquaza. Essentially, Groudon and Rayquaza do the same thing. It just so happens that Rayquaza gets set up faster than you. Quite a lot faster. It takes 1 less energy and can use DCE. Rayquaza's 2 energy attachments, Groudon's 4. And of course, again, it actually doesn't have a terrible Edgeslash matchup because you can just come along and just put basic energy on there. But then you might end up missing an energy drop because you are really worried about the fact that, you're only attaching basic fighting. So any turn you don't find a basic fighting, you're missing an energy drop. And even if you get them, your opponent can bring out a big Mewtwo and KO you anyway. Hey ho, what can you do? Seismitoad, I don't know how you play Seismitoad at the moment. There's a couple of options. You can play it with Crawdaunt to discard your opponent's energy, but then you can't reuse your hammers, your lasers, and your Crawdaunt, so that's going to be a problem. You can play it with Garbodor, Manectric, Mewtwo, Bats, and it's all the same kind of theory. You block them with trainers while you get rid of their energy, / poison them, / spread energy around with Bats, and then you finish them off with an attacker like Mewtwo. It's not a bad deck, but again, it's not going to be great against Rayquaza, and it's not going to be, even Hawluchas. I faced 2 Seismitoads last week. Now, they weren't Seismitoad-based decks. Both decks didn't play lasers, and both of them, they brought out Seismitoad. I 2-hit KO it with a Hawlucha. If they can't hit their lasers, and if they've only got 4, they ain't going to hit them all that as often as they used to, then in that situation, they really are going to be struggling to take down Hawluchas, and that's a problem. Trevenant is a deck which I have completely lost faith in. I think coming up to, I think I've given you a list of decks before which I think are good, and Trevenant's been on that list for a little while. I've completely lost faith, and here's the reason. Trevenant if you hit a turn 1 Wally, you evolve Phantom to Trevenant, turn 1 of the game, and you've got Perpetual Trainer Lock from turn 1 of the game. And that sounds wonderful, and it is wonderful. But it takes 2 energy attachments to be getting the KO. To be doing an attack. And a lot of these decks, like Rayquaza, like Groudon, like Raichu for goodness sake, like Night March, they're getting KOs on you very quickly. And if you can't keep up 2 energy attachments on a Trevenant, you're hitting for a maximum of 50 per turn with Shaman. And that isn't going to get you winning very quickly. It's still a good deck, and turn 1 Perpetual Trainer Lock is still amazing. I just don't think I think people are going to do well with it. But I think it's going to take a special player and a special list, because essentially, as soon as a Rayquaza player gets free energy on, you're toast. As soon as a metal player, and obviously if you come across metal, not only are they resistant to you, but also you can't use DCE. You're now down to free energy attachments just to do an attack. So Night March is probably KOing you nice and quickly, unless you get the turn 1 Trainer Lock going first. Because they only need 6 Night March in a discard pile. If you give them 1 turn, they can get 6 Night March in a discard pile. Rayquaza needs to get free energy on, and then they're probably going to be 1-hit KOing you, and you're not going to be able to get the 2 energy attachments going. And then you get the Edgeslash coming out, in a metal deck, and Edgeslash stops you because you've got to get free energy attachments on. I do quite like it against Fighting Bats. Although, no, see, I'm not even a huge fan of Fighting Bats. Now, I mean, Laser's good against Landorus, I'll give you that. The Laser comes out really useful against Landorus. But the fact is, Landorus is going to hit 30 on the bench while they're putting energy around with Golbat and Crobat if they can draw into them. So I would still take Trevenant in a 1-on-1 fight, but it's not a terrible matchup. Yveltal, Absol, Bats, I went through at the beginning of the podcast. I don't really have much to add to that. I like it as a deck, but I worry against Night March just with the fact that they're hitting you for weakness and they're more efficient than you. Disclaimer coming in a second. And I worry against Rayquaza that you're not going to do enough damage and they're going to be able to KO you nice and quickly. Fighting Bats it would have a decent shout against. And Metal Edgeslash, you can go completely without special energy, so that's good. Now, the one thing I should mention with Night March and Yveltal is non-EX Yveltal is an excellent Night March counter. Because you do 60 damage for 1 energy to a Pumpkaboo because of weakness, 30 damage for 1 energy to a Joltik, they're both 1-hit KOs, and then if they start attacking with 120 HP Mew, hello Yveltal EX. So actually, thinking about it, Yveltal has a pretty good Night March matchup, and a pretty good Metal matchup, because you can completely get rid of basic energy. You can basically attack with basic energy and non-EX Pokemon all game. Rayquaza I still think is a little bit of a problem, and Fighting Bats could go either way, although you've got resistance and that will really help. So maybe Trevenant Absol Bats is better than I'm giving it credit for, but I think it's quite late to test that deck. I quite fancy that one for Nats, actually. I like that. I like that one a lot. More than I gave it credit for initially, shall we say. And finally, Raichu / Landorus / Garbodor / Bats. And I know that's not a particularly easy way to put it, but the fact of the matter is that Raichu, they're all good cards in their own right, and it all comes down to what proportion you want. It all comes down to what decks you're trying to counter. If you're worried about Rayquaza, then you might add a little bit more Raichu. If you're worried about Metal, you add a little bit more Garbodor. In theory, Garbodor takes out the Metal decks, Raichu takes out the Rayquaza. The Bats / Raichu take down Night March because they're losing their ability to trade prizes nicely. And, your Garbodor / Landorus / Raichu takes down Fighting Bats quite nicely. Again, Yveltal and Raichu decks, or Raichu, Landorus, Garbodor, Bats, both of these decks, they're decks that if you just compare them to the top 4 decks, they look pretty good and they could potentially counter them. But they also could easily lose, and there'll be plenty of other decks that fail. I mean, a Raichu, Bats, Garbodor deck is going to be incredibly vulnerable to Latios, because you're not hitting for weakness. You're probably going to be 2-hit KOing Latios, and they're sitting there 1-hit KOing all of your basic Pokemon, potentially from turn 1. Pikachu, Zubat, they're all going down on the first turn of the game. Trubbish if they've got a laser and a muscle band. So, shall we say problems. Now, in terms of decks, like I say, Fighting Bats, Night March, Rayquaza, and Metal, they are, from the information we've got, and I'm a big fan of using past information rather than just my own opinion, they seem to be the top decks for this weekend. You should also consider Donphan, Groudon, Toad, Trevenant as alternatives, and if you want to go anti-meta with a decent chance of winning, Yveltal, Absol, Bats, or Landorus, Garbodor, Bats, Raichu, or any combination thereof. Now, I know some decks have been running around with Flareon and Leafeon, but most of them have been teching them into existing decks. I don't think they're good enough on their own, but certainly I could see you putting, a 1-1 Leafeon line in a deck, and 1-1 Leafeon is good against Groudon. So, you could put Leafeon in there to try and take down Groudon, or something of that nature. If you're worried about Groudon, just a 1-1 Leafeon will probably get through one Groudon. So, interesting, shall we say. So, the Professor Cup. Let's have a chat about the Professor Cup. Now, I must confess that, as always, like this year, I look at the Professor Cup format, and my head starts swimming with possibilities. But just like last year was the uncommons from XY and Flashfire, and it essentially came down to Torkoal and... the thing that evolves from Bergmite. This is going to annoy me. The ice Pokemon, shall we say. We'll remember him in a minute. But, that was basically what it came down to. It was a similar thing this year. I started off by going, right, I am going to sit here and I am going to go through every Pokemon that's been released that fits the criteria. Avalugg. That's what he's called. And I'm going to sit through Pokemon by Pokemon. And unfortunately, got bored kind of quickly, unfortunately. So, let's have a look at the format first of all. 60 card decks, not 30 or 40, which is unusual. Professor Cup is rarely 60 card decks. Only common Pokemon from XY onwards. So you've basically got X and Y, Flashfire, Furious Fists, Phantom Forces, Primal Clash, Roaring Skies, and of course you've got Double Crisis going on in there as well. Which is good, because it's very good. We'll get there in a minute. No Black Star promos. The only uncommons you can use are trainers. So you can use trainers and special energy that are uncommons. Otherwise, it's commons only. The other fun little rule is that you need the amount of energy listed, but you can use any energy. So if the attack costs double colourless, you can use a double colourless or any 2 energy. But if the attack is fighting double colourless, you can use double colourless and any 3rd energy. It doesn't have to be fighting. Similarly, if the attack is fighting water, you could use 2 fire energy, because essentially all basic energy are the same. Double colourless still only does colourless. So to reiterate, commons only, XY on, special energy and uncommon trainers are also available, and all basic energy satisfies all basic energy requirements. And I started going down, like I do every year with the Professor Cup. I said, okay, it starts from XY, let's have a look at all the commons from X and Y. Now let's have a look at all the commons from Flashfire. And I'm going to be honest with you. Now, I'm not saying that nobody, again, like I said with Nationals, I'm not saying that nobody is going to come up with some amazing thing I've not thought of. I'd be surprised, but stranger things have happened. But I've had a good look through, and I've had a chat with some of my friends, and I haven't tested this extensively as I would like, but the way I see it, there are 3 viable decks. So all I'm going to do is go through the 3 viable decks. Now, your first thought here should be Night March. Night March comes from Phantom Forces, which means it's up for grabs. Lampent is an uncommon. Lampent's out the window. But you've still got your Joltik, and you've still got your Pumpkaboo. Now, you will need to play something here because you don't have the kind of leeway that you've got in terms of discarding Pokemon like you do in the other format because you've only got so few of them. But the thing to remember here is that you're basically dealing with a majority of Pokemon having 60 HP, with a very few of them having 70 to 90. So you get 5 of your 8 Night March in the discard pile, you one-hit KOing everything. You get 4 in the discard pile, and you're basically one-hit KOing everything, as long as you've got a Muscle Band out. The other thing to remember here, of course, is that you will be incredibly reliant on double colourless energy. And let's remember, no EXs, so you're basically talking, you've got to actually take 6 prizes. And you've only got 4 DCE. And what that means is that you can only attack with 1 energy 4 times. There's no Mew Dimension Valley here. It's Joltik DCE or Pumpkaboo DCE Dimension Valley. So if you're trading one-hit KOs with your opponent, you are going to have to find 2 KOs somewhere else. Now, I'm going to go through some other Pokemon in a minute. Let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that what I'm saying here about Night March, there's going to be plenty of space. There's going to be a lot of space in these decks because, let's face it, you're using, a few energy, and we'll get to that in a minute, but you're going to want 1 energy attackers. And, you're probably going to be playing, 8 common Pokemon. There's not really going to be any evolving. So you're going to be playing, 8 Pokemon and 8 energy. And then, 44 traits. You've got a lot of space here. You can easily add in more Pokemon if you want. So, that's Night March. I wouldn't play Night March for this format because I'm thinking, okay, some games I'm going to get a really good start, and I'm only going to need 4 DCE. But I'm going to come across good players, especially if I do well in the tournament. I'm going to come across good players, and they're going to get a lot of KOs. And then I'm going to run out of DCE and not have any attackers. So that's Night March. Remember, you will need Dimension Valley for that deck. The other one that springs to mind is Double Crisis. I say springs to mind. Springs to mind if you're aware of Double Crisis. Then we dealt with Double Crisis on this podcast. I gave you an awful lot of information about it. The thing was that none of these cards were good in standard format. They are good in this format. As one card in particular, Team Magma's Secret Base. Whenever any player puts a basic Pokemon, except for Team Magma Pokemon, from his or her hand onto his or her bench, put 2 damage counters onto that Pokemon. Now, when you're dealing with Pokemon that generally have about 60 HP each, 2 damage counters is huge. It's utterly massive. So you want to be playing Team Magma Pokemon just for the sake of being able to play this stadium. It's awesome. Downside, you've only really got 2 attackers that I can see that are worth it. Firstly, Team Magma's Zangoose. Good news, 90 HP. Bad news, weakness to fighting, and that's going to come into play in a minute. First attack, Call for Family, 2 Team Magma Pokemon, put them on your bench. Okay if you've got nothing else to do. Second attack, free energy, 20 times the number of Team Magma Pokemon on your bench. You fill a bench, you're doing 100 damage, you're one-hit KOing everything. I'm not a huge fan of Zangoose because it takes 2 energy attachments, and one of them needs to be a DCE. And if all 4 of your Zangoose go down, you can just use the trainer to get 5 back into your deck. You can use Sacred Ash to put all 4 of your Zangoose back in your deck, I should say, plus anything else, one other thing. But that's not actually going to help you power him up. I think Zangoose is a bit too slow. Now, the other one I like, it's not Numel, because Numel, again, has 2 energy attachments, and it's just too slow for me. This format, I really do think you want 1 energy attachment. The other one I like is Aaron. And Aaron is the absolute example. It's a perfect example of this format. Basic Pokemon, 60 HP, 10 damage for 1 energy. It's exactly what you would expect. And the reason I stopped going through every common Pokemon was it's just type after type of 10 or 20 damage for 1 energy attachment. But of course, Aaron can use Strong Energy. Strong Energy Muscle Band, you're now doing 50 damage for 1 energy, and your opponent has had to put 2 damage counters on by putting down a Pokemon with Team Magma Stadium in play. That makes Aaron doing essentially 70 damage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will KO pretty much every relevant Pokemon in the format. It's beautiful. That is, of course, assuming that your opponent doesn't counter Team Magma's Secret Hideout before putting it down. That is the big downside of Team Magma's Secret Hideout. It is in your opponent's hand, so your opponent can wait, counter the stadium, and then bench their Pokemon. I'm not a huge fan of Zangoose. I am a huge fan of Aaron. I think Aaron, Team Magma's Secret Hideout, would potentially be my deck for the tournament. I would love to play that deck in this tournament. I don't know if I'd play it. I think the next deck might be slightly better, but I'm a big fan of playing Aaron. Now, the next is probably my starter for 10 best card in the format. And it's really not that good. It just fits this format. Now, the three things I immediately thought with this format were Double Crisis Magma Pokemon because of the stadium, Night March because it's a viable deck for US Nationals involving commons, and Fighting Pokemon. Now, Fighting Stadium's out the window because it only helps the X's, but you've got Focus Sash, which means that if you are one-hit KO'd, as a lot of Pokemon will be in this format, you're not one-hit KO'd, you just discard Focus Sash. And then you can use Strong Energy to do 20 more damage. Now, Meditite only has 50 HP, and that worries me, but it does 20 damage. Plus Strong Energy, plus Muscle Band, 60 damage on turn 1 for 1 energy. That's awesome. Now, you also want to be thinking Magnetic Storm. That's the stadium that takes away resistance, and here's why. 60 HP, 60 damage, KO's Joltik. Pumpkaboo's resistant, but use Magnetic Storm to take away resistance. It one-hit KOs that. One-hit KOs Aaron, and it one-hit KOs Zangoose. And indeed, it one-hit KOs Meditite. It basically one-hit KOs every relevant Pokemon in the format. That, ladies and gentlemen, is good. Also, I'm not against playing a couple of Team Magma's hideouts when you're not playing a Team Magma deck. Bench all your Pokemon, boom, Team Magma's hideout. Get some extra damage going on. Might work. Who knows? The other thing you should bear in mind about fighting, of course, is that Enhanced Hammer was reprinted since X and Y and can get rid of Strong Energy and hurt you. Now, we're going to get some general rules of this format in a minute, but I've got 3 other notes here. I've seen people loving Primal Clash Spinder. It does 10 damage to all of your Pokemon for 1 energy. Let me be clear about this. I ain't playing Spinder. Aaron does potentially 50 damage for 1 energy. Meditite, 60 damage for 1 energy. And then if you're playing Night March, which I'd go against, then Joltik and Pumpkaboo could be doing 100 damage for 1 energy. That's what I'm going for, ladies and gentlemen. I don't want 10 damage to everything. I might play 1 just for funsies. The other thing is it's weak to fighting. That ain't good. Now, have a look at the format. Have a look at what you expect to see. If you're really worried about any particular type, you are covered. Most Pokemon have about 60 HP, and every type has got 10 damage for 1 energy. And remember, that energy can actually be done by any basic energy in this format. Stick a Muscle Band, 60 HP, getting a KO. Worried about Pumpkaboo, get a Zorua, 1 energy, Muscle Band, boom, 60 damage. You know, worried about Meditite, name a psychic Pokemon, go find a common that does 10 damage for 1 energy, Muscle Band, boom, KO, easy. So, anything in this format is very easily countered. So I'm not going to sit here and give you a big long list of Pokemon that do 10 damage for 1 energy. Just go and have a look. Pokegym.net/tower is a good one to look at. You can search by set. And just literally any type you want to counter, there will be a counter because Muscle Band is basically the best card in the format. Now there's one other deck, and I don't know if I'd have the balls to play this. But there's one other deck which became a bit of a pet project of mine this past week. And that is, now I'm going Cubchoo, but you could go any Pokemon you want, as long as it's water. Electric Pokemon are out the window because they're weak to fighting, and we're going to see that's bad. But I'm thinking here, use Rough Season Hard Charm to just tank water Pokemon. Let's say Cubchoo. I like Cubchoo, so it's got 70 HP. With a Hard Charm on there, Your opponent is hitting you for 20 less, next turn you use Rough Seas, and you're essentially stopping 50 damage from your opponent's Pokemon. Which means your opponent, first of all, to KO you, they have to do 90 damage. And if they can't do that, you're going to heal 30 off the following turn. And then you've got things like Fresh Water Set and Potion that can heal you even more. I'm a big fan of this water deck. Now, I don't know if it's going to be as good, but for instance, Meditite isn't going to one-hit KO you. Aaron's not going to one-hit KO you unless you bench with a Magma Stadium down. Zangoose can one-hit KO you, to be fair, as can the Night Marchers, and that's why I wouldn't play it. But I love the idea of playing Cubchoo with your like I say, with healing cards and Rough Seas and Hard Charm. Now, it does 10 damage for each heads out of 3 coin flips, so between 0 and 30, it's not a great attack, but you sit and wear them down while you tank. I don't think it's as good as the other decks, just so we're clear, but I quite like it. There's also a Bergmite, the same one, in fact, that we actually used last Professor Cup for the Uncommon Avalugg. And for 1 energy, it discards the top card of their deck, and for 3 energy, it does quite a bit of damage, but it's going to be hard to get the DC and the water on there. So, my official advice, play Aaron or play Meditite. Simple as that. They are, as far as I'm concerned, the best cards in the format, and I would probably just play Aaron and Meditite with Team Magma's Hangout, and that would be it. Now, some general notes for this format. Firstly, Muscle Band is going to be best card in the format. Play 4 of them. And think about healing. Because if your opponent ain't one-hit KOing you, you can heal a lot with cards like Fresh Water Set. Secondly, you must play a Stadium. And you've got to play 4 of them. Because against Magma decks, you're going to be screwed by their Stadium. Against Water decks, you're going to be screwed by their Stadium. Against Night March, you're going to be screwed by their Stadium. Even though we're playing with common Pokemon, ladies and gentlemen, you need to play a Stadium. You need to get ready for the Stadium Wars. Let's get that right out of the way here. Secondly, I would go second. And my deck, and again, I haven't tested this extensively, I'm going Aaron with Magma's Hideout and Meditite. And obviously, I'm not putting down the Magma's Hideout if I'm going to bench a bunch of Meditite. I'm not silly. But I would go second. Because basically, anything my opponent can put down, I'm going to be one-hit KOing, unless they put down like a 70 HP Pokemon that isn't weak to fighting. And there aren't many good ones out there. So I want to go second here, with Aaron and Meditite. Thirdly, I'm going speed in this format. Because, okay, there's no shame in, but there's also no Trainer Lock. Trevenant, Seismitoad, they're out. So I'm building a deck here. I would probably be playing about 8 Pokemon, 10 energy here. That gives me 42 trainers. And what do you need? 4 Stadium, 4 Muscle Band. You can play Ultra Ball, but I probably wouldn't bother playing Ultra Ball given how fast I'm going to be running through my deck. Few switches. You don't need very much here. So I would be playing a ridiculous speed deck because you can use things like roller skates, bicycle, acro bike, trainer's mail, etc, 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 etc. We've got a lot of trainer draw. Ignore bicycle, by the way. Bicycle is, of course, Plasma Storm. I'm an idiot. But you've still got acro bike, roller skates. Maintenance is a decent one. And then you can even run things like Fiery Torch and just put fire energy as your basic energy because fire energy will be any other energy. So, yeah, I'd even consider going for a stadium like Scorched Earth, although, as I've said, most decks have better stadiums to use. So that's personally what I would do in this format. I would want to go second, I would make a speed deck with a whole bunch of trainer draw, and I would be going around Aaron and Meditite. Because, to be honest with you, that's going to beat mostly everything. And you're going to have quick games just in case you end up with a draw. So, I like this. That's what I would go for. Night March is viable, but I worry about the DCEs. And this Magma deck is, it is very... It's very viable, and I'm kind of combining that with Meditite. Meditite is weirdly the best card in the format here. And that is my rundown of US Nationals and the Professor Cup. And as we're coming up to an hour and 4 minutes, I think that's probably about enough stuff for you guys today. If you are listening to this on the way to US Nationals, good luck to you. And I mean you personally, Steve. I don't know if there's anyone out there listening called Steve, but I really hope there is, because that would have been very freaky for them. But genuinely, if you're listening to this podcast, I want you to win more than anyone who's not listening to this podcast. I'm biased and I'm unashamed. If you do well at US Nationals, or if you don't, hit me up on Twitter at @TheWassy, email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk, let me know how you did. And I think that's about it. Make sure you check out these new games I'm putting up on YouTube, youtube.com/PTCGRadio. And for goodness sake, go check out Wassy Plays. I will be back next week with another lovely podcast, so look after yourselves till then. My name's Ross, and you've been listening to PTCG Radio.